Lecture 79, Virginia Woolf.
Mr. Dalloway, ma'am. Clarissa read on the telephone pad, Lady Bruton wishes to know if Mr. Dalloway will lunch with her today. Mr. Dalloway, ma'am, told me to tell you he would be lunching out. Dear, said Clarissa, and Lucy shared, as she meant her to, her disappointment, but not the pang, felt the concord between them, took the hint, thought how the gentry love, gilded her own future with calm, and, taking Mrs. Dalloway's parasol, handled it like a sacred weapon which a goddess, having acquitted herself honorably in the field of battle, shed and placed it in the umbrella stand. Fear no more, said Clarissa. Fear no more the heat of the sun. For the shock of Lady Bruton asking Richard to lunch without her made the moment in which she stood shiver, as a plant on the riverbed feels the shock of a passing oar, and shivers. So she rocked, so she shivered. The rocking, shivering lady is Clarissa Dalloway, heroine of Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway, which first appeared in 1925. Married to a member of the British Parliament, Clarissa Dalloway occupies an expensively furnished house in London's Westminster, where the Houses of Parliament stand and where the Prime Minister lives. In the early morning of a bright, clear day in the middle of June 1923, Clarissa has left her house to buy flowers for a large party that will bring to her house a number of distinguished people, including the Prime Minister himself. She's a grand lady, and when she returns to her house, her servant takes her parasol as if it were a sacred weapon that has been used by a goddess on the field of battle. But at the same time, Mrs. Dalloway makes a disappointing discovery. Her husband will not be home for lunch because he's been invited without his wife to lunch with Lady Bruton. Since Clarissa has no reason to be jealous of Richard, she feels instead the pain of deprivation, of missing out on a party that promised to be, quote, extraordinarily amusing, unquote. Slight as it may seem, especially in light of her own grand party to come, the disappointment brings her something like the chill of death. Fear no more, she says, remembering the words of a Shakespearean poem that she has just been reading in a bookshop window. In the poem, which comes from a play called Cymbeline, two young people sing a song of mourning to a third who has evidently just died. Fear no more, they say. Fear no more the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages. Clarissa does not fear the winter, but she nonetheless feels a death-like chill of disappointment, a chill that crosses the threshold of her house, even as London stands on the threshold of summer. Clarissa does not warm up easily. 51, gray-haired, and very pale as the result of a heart condition, she sleeps alone in a narrow bed in the attic of her house because her husband does not want to disturb her when he comes home late from his work. She knows this arrangement reflects her frigidity. She knows that she lacks a certain warmth. It's the price she pays for guarding her privacy. She and her husband have just one child, and while they still feel affection for each other, they show no signs of desire. All of this helps to explain why the pain of missing out on a party should make Clarissa feel suddenly shriveled, aged, breastless, as if ready to die. This is a novel about life and death. The life of a gracious, lively woman who seems to epitomize the high society of London in the early 20s, and the death of a young man irretrievably traumatized by the First World War. But the novel also includes a man who once passionately loved Clarissa, who wanted to marry her, and whom she has never forgotten. He swims up into her consciousness on the very first page of the novel. As she steps out into the fresh morning air of the city, she remembers the morning air at her parents' country estate when she was a girl of 18. She also remembers the voice of Peter Walsh, who has been working for years in India, but has written that he plans to visit London this very summer. He will actually turn up at Clarissa's house in the late morning of this day and will reappear at her party that evening. But in the meantime, he takes his place at once in the stream of memories that flow through her mind on this day. For in this novel, remembered sights and sounds can be just as potent and vivid as anything that happens in the time present of Clarissa's day. By this I don't mean that Clarissa tells the story of her life. Clarissa isn't a storyteller. She's a woman living through a day and evening that are reported to us by an omniscient narrator with access to the mind of every character in the book. And the memories of each character, particularly the major ones, play a vital role in Virginia Woolf's method of storytelling. For instead of using exposition, instead of explaining the history of her characters as each one is introduced, she tunnels down into their minds and digs out just what they remember at a particular time. Virginia Woolf was hardly the first to create characters with powerful memories. In Dickens' Great Expectations, Pip vividly recalls a whole series of events from his past. And in Marcel Proust's Swan's Way, published a dozen years before Mrs. Dalloway, the taste of a bit of pastry dipped in tea summons up a whole cluster of memories from the narrator's childhood. But in Woolf's novel, memory is not simply a motor used to activate a narrative or a fishhook used to catch something long forgotten in the backwaters of the mind. Instead, memory is a vital part of everyday human experience. Woolf's novel makes us all realize that we don't live our lives in a straight line. In every day's journey from morning to night, we meet sights, sounds, and even smells that take us back to our past, to people and places we may not have seen for years. The novel underscores this point by making sure we understand that every character in it, no matter how small, has an inner life, a private world of thoughts, feelings, and memories that are relayed to us by the omniscient narrator. This feature of Mrs. Dalloway radically distinguishes it from virtually all the fiction that came before it. In novels such as Great Expectations and Swan's Way, the narrator wallows in his past, but he alone is privileged to reveal his memories to us, and we see the other characters only through his eyes. In Mrs. Dalloway, a number of characters live with their memories, and we often see the main character through the eyes of others. In the passage we started with, Clarissa is perceived by her servant Lucy. As soon as Lucy tells her that Mr. Dalloway will be lunching out, Clarissa says, "Dear," and then we suddenly find ourselves inside the head of Lucy, who shares Clarissa's disappointment, feels for her, and thinks how the gentry love, how upper-class married couples get on. This little passage marks something of a turning point in social history, as well as in the history of the novel. In the early 19th century novels of Jane Austen, servants barely have names. And even in early 20th century fiction, they seldom, if ever, display this kind of sensitivity. By entering the mind and heart of a servant, no matter how briefly, Virginia Woolf democratizes the novel, even as she represents a world that is clearly stratified by class. Virginia Woolf herself came from the upper middle class. Daughter of a distinguished scholar and literary critic named Leslie Stephen, she was raised in London along with her 7 siblings and educated at home by her parents and governesses. In 1895, when she was 13, the death of her mother provoked the first of her mental breakdowns, which ended only when she drowned herself in 1941 at the age of 59. But it's a great mistake to read her whole life in the dark light of its ending. We do much better to read it in the shining light of her achievement. In spite of the depression that periodically seized her, she read voraciously, wrote prolifically, and lived fully. She relished a circle of immensely stimulating friends. When her father died, she and her siblings moved to the Bloomsbury part of London and gathered about them a set of writers, artists, and philosophers who came to be known as the Bloomsbury Group. They included Leonard Woolf, a writer and socialist politician whom Virginia married in 1912. Now, before marrying Leonard, Virginia had finished at least one complete draft of her first novel, The Voyage Out. With Leonard's encouragement, she saw this novel through to publication in 1915 and went on to write many more. In the language and narrative technique of Jacob's Room, her third novel, which appeared in 1922, she first deployed the innovations that made her a celebrity in her own time and have since marked her as a quintessential modernist. Essentially, she recreated the whole idea of character by representing the mind as a conduit for impressions and memories that flow through it constantly and yet also capriciously, in unpredictable order. Her sentence structure tracks this meandering movement. Instead of running like a railway line from one point to another, her sentences make way for the capriciousness, the unwieldiness of what goes through our heads. Take, for instance, what goes through the head of Clarissa Dalloway just before she learns about Lady Bruton's lunch from Lucy and from a written message on a notepad. Stepping into the entrance of her house, she feels grateful for all its comforts. Quote, "Not for a moment did she believe in God, but all the more, she thought, taking up the pad, must one repay in daily life to servants, yes, to dogs and canaries, above all to Richard, her husband, who was the foundation of it, of the gay sounds, of the green lights, of the cook even whistling, for Mrs. Walker was Irish and whistled all day long. One must pay back from this secret deposit of exquisite moments, she thought, lifting the pad while Lucy stood by her, trying to explain how, 'Mr. Dalloway, ma'am,' end quote." Yeah, I've quoted here only the second part of a long sentence. But do you see how this sentence captures the movements of Clarissa's mind? More like a bird than a railway train, her brain darts from one thing to another. Thankfulness, the servants in general, dogs, canaries, her husband, the whistling Irish cook in particular. All this, even as she's picking up the pad to read its written message and hearing the spoken words of Lucy. Virginia Woolf revolutionized the novel by challenging the conventions of realism, by showing something new about the way human beings actually think. In this revolutionary enterprise, Virginia Woolf had one great rival. By 1924, when she wrote Mrs. Dalloway, she was already quite familiar with his most famous book. For 6 years earlier, it had been offered to the Woolfs themselves for publication by their own Hogarth Press. Partly because they might be prosecuted for publishing obscenity, they turned it down. And in her diary, Virginia called it Underbred, the book of a self-taught working man. She thus dismissed what T.S. Eliot called the most important expression which the present age has found, unquote. He was talking about James Joyce's Ulysses, published in 1922. In Eliot's view, this was a book to which we are all indebted and from which none of us can escape. A book from which none of us can escape. That's what Eliot said. After first seeing this book in 1918, 4 years before it was published, could Virginia Woolf herself escape it? I think not. Possibly she was fated to be juxtaposed with Joyce. Born precisely 1 week before him, she died just over 10 weeks after he did. Whatever that curious coincidence may tell us about Woolf and Joyce, the parallels between Ulysses and Mrs. Dalloway are striking. Ulysses tells the story of what 3 characters do on a single day in the middle of June in the city of Dublin. Mrs. Dalloway tells the story of what 3 characters do on a single day in the middle of June in the city of London. In each novel, the most important character is the middle-aged parent of just one living child, a teenage daughter. In each novel, the 2 chief male characters spend much of their day wandering around a city whose streets and parks and monuments are carefully specified. And through the minds of these characters flows a steady stream of present-tense impressions, mixed with memories, unpredictable associations, and sudden, irrational impulses. Mrs. Dalloway herself has little in common with any of Joyce's characters, but some of her actions recall by turns both Molly and Leopold Bloom. At the end of her monologue, which she silently speaks while lying in bed in the last chapter of Ulysses, Molly resolves to get up early so as to go out and order flowers to be sent to her house, exactly what Clarissa does in the opening pages of Mrs. Dalloway. Also, when Bloom comes home after going out briefly in the morning, he finds in his hallway a letter for his wife sent by another man and feels a twinge of anxiety. When Clarissa returns to find in her hallway a message left for her husband by another woman, she feels a pang of disappointment. So, what am I trying to prove with all these parallels? That Virginia Woolf's novel is just a rip-off, a pale English replica of Ulysses? Absolutely not. Virginia Woolf no more rips off Ulysses than Joyce rips off Homer. Joyce proved his originality by openly and radically reconstructing the plot of Homer's Odyssey. Without ever openly admitting any debt to Ulysses, Virginia Woolf proved her originality by radically reconstructing it, even while making the parallels between the 2 books unmistakably clear. To begin with, the title figure and heroine of Mrs. Dalloway differs sharply from anyone we meet in Ulysses, especially Molly Bloom. Molly distrusts all other women, wants only to be loved by men, and rapturously recalls her first experience of sexual intercourse. By contrast, Clarissa Dalloway is sexually frigid. Having rejected the only man she ever knew, who loved her passionately, and having married instead a rich, respectable, affectionate, but unexciting man, she vividly remembers, quote, the most exquisite moment of her whole life as the time she was kissed on the lips by a young woman. In addition, Clarissa is nowhere as self-absorbed as Molly. Though she cherishes her privacy and spends part of her day napping, she takes great pride and pleasure in giving parties because they enable her to bring together people who might otherwise never meet. She thus stands, in a way, for the novelist herself. Just as Virginia Woolf gathers a large cast of characters, ranging from her socially prominent heroine to a beggar woman outside Regent's Park, Clarissa assembles a wide variety of people for her party. Here, she thinks, was so-and-so in South Kensington, someone up in Bayswater, and someone else, say, in Mayfair. And she felt quite continuously a sense of their existence, and she felt what a waste, and she felt what a pity, and she felt if only they could be brought together. So she did it. And it was an offering to combine, to create. But to whom? An offering for the sake of offering, perhaps? Anyhow, it was her gift. Nothing else had she of the slightest importance. She could not think, write, even play the piano. Clarissa Dalloway, in short, creates parties. She cultivates the art of being a hostess. We may, of course, see hostessing as one of the lesser arts, if it deserves to be called an art at all. All too often, parties choke the voice of real communication, as T.S. Eliot shows in The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, published in 1917, a poem that Virginia Woolf knew very well. As the hapless Prufrock prepares his face for a tea party, he ruefully foresees that he will never have the guts to pose a question of any importance, because such a question would never be understood at a party. Within the novel itself, Clarissa knows very well that Peter Walsh finds her parties nonsensical, and the party she gives on the day of this novel seems at times no more than a mechanical exercise. When the guests are announced in rapid succession, about all that Clarissa can say to each one is, "How delightful to see you." Also, even though Clarissa loves mixing people, the guests at her predominantly upper-class party certainly do not include the beggar woman or anyone below the middle class. The farthest down she goes is a poor cousin named Ellie Henderson, whom Clarissa reluctantly invites just a few hours before the party begins. All this seems to confirm what Virginia Woolf told her diary about this novel. I want to criticize the social system and to show it at work at its most intense. Unquote. But Virginia Woolf is not just updating the social satire of the Victorian novelists, doing again what Thackeray and Dickens had done before her. Instead, she brings a democratic vision to this novel, a vision that shapes its narrative form quite as much as it generates its range of characters. In multiplying perspectives, in shifting from one character's point of view to another, Mrs. Dalloway shows its debt to the narrative techniques of Joyce's Ulysses. But unlike Joyce, Woolf never marks these shifts by assigning a chapter or section of a chapter to a particular viewpoint, and only rarely does her omniscient narrator shift into the language of an interior monologue. There are no chapters or sections of any kind in this compact novel which flows without a break from beginning to end. And its fluidity is enhanced by the persistence of the narrator's voice, which guides us instantly from one character's viewpoint to another. When Peter Walsh tells Clarissa that the Prime Minister has arrived at her party, we suddenly get not her reaction, but Ellie Henderson's. "The Prime Minister? Was it really?" Ellie Henderson marveled. What a thing to tell Edith! One couldn't laugh at him. He looked so ordinary. You might have stood him behind a counter and bought biscuits, poor chap, all rigged up in gold lace. And to be fair, as he went his rounds, first with Clarissa and then with Richard escorting him, he did it very well. He tried to look somebody." Unquote. The narrative technique here takes us all around the Prime Minister, just the way a museum guide might take us all the way around a work of sculpture. We see the Prime Minister through the eyes of a poor, commonplace woman who is at first dazzled by the thought of seeing such a great man and telling her friend about it. What a thing to tell! But she doesn't just dissolve in admiration. On the contrary, This poor, ordinary woman is first amused by the ordinariness of the Prime Minister's looks, then stirred to pity for this poor chap trussed up in lace, then finally impressed by his poise or his effort to play his role. He tried to look somebody. Ellie brings her own voice and vision to this party. She sees the great man with eyes that are all at once clear-sighted, generous, and unmistakably democratic. In a very strange way, the party also includes a man who never comes at all because he was not invited and because he killed himself before the party began. But when Clarissa learns of his death, she is profoundly moved to admiration for reasons that I can only begin to suggest in the few moments I have left. Septimus Smith, the young man who killed himself, survived the First World War, the bloodiest war that England had ever fought up to that time. To remember what happened here in America on September 11th, 2001, is to feel only a tiny fraction of what the British suffered from that war. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, on July 1st, 1918, nearly 19,000 British soldiers were killed, and the war as a whole took almost 1 million British lives. For this reason, it is, I think, impossible to overstate the impact of the First World War upon the British. Woolf's novel sometimes registers that impact quite explicitly. As he walks up Whitehall at one point, Peter Walsh is overtaken by a uniformed troop of teenage boys marching to Westminster Abbey to lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown warrior. But the novel goes well beyond noting such rituals of commemoration. When it playfully compares the returning Clarissa to a goddess who has fought on a field of battle, it darkly reminds us of all the men who died in battle. To the very end, in fact, this novel makes the ineradicable memory of war participate in what seems to epitomize the pleasures of peace, a glittering party for London's high society in 1923. In England, as in America, the 1920s was an age of sudden freedom from old conventions and proprieties. In To Let, the third novel of his Forsyte saga, published in 1921, John Galsworthy marks the coming of the Jazz Age, which means, among other things, low necklines and women riding horses astride, just like men. Soames Forsyte, a middle-aged man with old-fashioned ideas, is shocked by these changes, just as Virginia Woolf's Peter Walsh is shocked to find girls putting on makeup in public. Trivial as they may seem to us now, these changes subtly reflect the impact of the war, for they help to show the impossibility of recovering the period that came just before it, that decade of light and decorum known as the Edwardian Age, after Edward VII, who ruled from 1901 to 1910. The very name of Septimus Smith recalls King Edward, for Septimus means seventh. But nothing could be less Edwardian than this traumatized survivor of war. He simply does not feel that he can live in any society at all. Though he fought with distinction, though he married an Italian woman who is wholly devoted to him, and though he's returned without injuries to a country that is proud, to a company, that is proud of his services to the nation and eager to promote him, in spite of all that, Septimus believes that he has lost his capacity to feel. When his dearest friend, a man named Evans, was killed in battle at the end of the war, he felt nothing. As a result, he loathes himself. He thinks that human nature itself has sentenced him to death. And while his wife insists that he consult one psychologist after another, not even the great Sir William Bradshaw can help him. For all his fame in medical circles, Bradshaw cannot see the real causes of Septimus's self-loathing. All he can see is a man who served in the war with distinction, who is highly regarded at his office, and who is inexplicably disturbed. When Septimus tells the doctor that he has committed a crime, his wife promptly assures the doctor that he has done nothing wrong whatever. But since Septimus has threatened to kill himself, Bradshaw concludes that he lacks a sense of proportion and must therefore be sent off at once for a rest cure. Blind and oppressive at once, Bradshaw fails to see that Septimus's anguish springs from his incapacity to grieve for the death of his friend Evans. It's not so much that all the slaughter of war has left Septimus emotionally numb. It's that post-war society dams up his tears. He cannot openly mourn the death of Evans because doing so would expose the intensity of a love that society forbids, the love between one man and another. So instead of grieving for Evans, Septimus has promptly tried to bury the memory of his love by taking a wife. But taking a wife has just intensified the guilt he feels for the crime of failing to mourn the man that he loved. This can be a deadly serious crime. In Albert Camus' novel, The Stranger, Moursault is denounced not only for murdering another man, but also for failing to mourn the death of his mother. According to the prosecutor, his failure to mourn her death makes him morally guilty of that death, no better than a parricide. In the societies that surround Moursault and Septimus, failure to grieve is just as intolerable as murder or homosexuality. Given all that, we can see why Bradshaw's rest cure for Septimus would simply suffocate his soul, and why he feels so irresistibly impelled to take his own life. Clarissa knows nothing of Septimus until she learns of his death from Bradshaw himself, who turns out to be one of the guests at her party. By this means, the ghost of Septimus attends the party along with the living person of Peter Walsh. In a remarkable passage near the end of the novel, Clarissa withdraws from her guest to a little empty room so she can think by herself about the suicide of Septimus. She is fascinated by the sheer daring of this act, which makes her think by contrast of all the compromises she has made in her own life and of what she has lost in the passage from the vitality of girlhood to the pale placidity of a respectable middle age. She and her girlhood friends, Peter Walsh and Sally Seton, the irrepressibly vital girl who kissed her so many years ago, she and her girlhood friends would grow old, she reflects, while this young man died. Quote, "A thing there was that mattered, a thing wreathed about with chatter, defaced, obscured in her own life, let drop every day in corruption, lies, chatter. This he had preserved. Death was defiance. Death was an attempt to communicate. There was an embrace in death." Across the great divide between life and death, Septimus speaks to Clarissa. Though she has achieved a social triumph at her party, she feels at once the emptiness of her life and the power of his death. As she stands before a window, looking out at an ashen sky filled with vast racing clouds, she feels, quote, somehow very like him, the young man who had killed himself. She felt glad that he had done it, thrown it away. In Virginia Woolf's original plan for this novel, Clarissa herself was to have committed suicide. Instead, she becomes a solitary witness to the meaning of another's suicide, and then returns to her party, her guests, and her life. At the very end of the novel, she is left alone with Peter Walsh, who wanted long ago to marry her, and who is now filled with, quote, extraordinary excitement, unquote, at the prospect of speaking to her. But what they say to each other we never learn. So the novel ends on a resounding note of indeterminacy. For better or worse, Clarissa's life will go on. After Mrs. Dalloway appeared in 1925, Virginia Woolf herself went on to write a great deal more. Besides letters and diaries, she produced 4 more novels and 2 landmark books on the rights of women, on their rights to higher education, on their right to a room of their own, on their right to a place at the table of literary and professional distinction, above all, distinction in literature. There she has made a lasting place for herself.